When you get calls from people that lead to needing to help them with those types of software integration with QuickBooks issues, what do they perceive they need when they first start talking to you?
For instance, they had ADP Payroll, but they weren't integrating that at all with QuickBooks. They didn't even know they could, just manually entering this stuff, and he was doing it incorrectly.
When they first talked to you, they were interested in your services, but what was their perception of their problem? Why did they want somebody to help them with the bookkeeping?
I've got my accounting in 2 different softwares, so I can't honestly see where I am financially. I have no clue where I am, what the health of the business is. He was using QuickBooks Online and Sage. He had up from January to May in QuickBooks Online, and he had from May to up till the time that I took him over in August was in Sage. And he said, I really want to go to QuickBooks Desktop and have everything all in one accounting software.
What was the process that got from that point to the point where you were then also helping them with some other software integration? How did that play out?
The first problem was his sales tax calculation. They weren't calculating sales tax. They were charging 9.75% sales tax to every customer invoice, which was incorrect because they didn't have a way to calculate accurately the sales tax.
Why would calculating at 9.75 be incorrect?
Because not everybody in California is 9.75. It's all over the place. I mean, some people are 8.75, some are 9.25. He was just using his current location's sales tax rate, which was incorrect. So that was the first thing I noticed. We needed to get him set up with Avalara so he's accurately calculating sales tax for California. He was overpaying tax. That's true, but it wasn't coming out of his pocket, so to speak, because he was charging the client.
So the net of it then is that he was overpaying tax, but it wasn't costing him anything because he was overcharging the client in some instances.
Right.
Even though he was overcharging the client, he was seeing no benefit from that other than his price was higher than it needed to be.
And the problem with that is if he were ever audited, look what he's done. He's charged all the wrong sales tax and paid California the wrong sales tax based on those sales. California would just come down on him like a ton of bricks.
And the bottom line then is that Avalara will just take care of all those calculations automatically?
Right. It automatically calculates that and correctly and does the tax returns correctly based on the ship to location. And not only that, the other advantage with Avalara is by doing what he's doing, and he's selling everywhere, Florida, Georgia, all these different places, he wouldn't know if he was nearing that nexus level for a state. And every state has something different.
The example that you just gave, where if you sell $1 worth, you're going to be liable for sales tax, where?
I think it was Georgia. I think Georgia is one of those states that there is no threshold. If you sell anything in their state, you have to set up an employer account and you're required to collect and remit sales tax.
So what you're saying then is that some states you reach nexus purely based on the amount of revenue you do in the state, not necessarily having actual people or offices in that state?
Yeah, every state has sales tax nexus. If you sell a certain amount and you brought that into our state, then they have a threshold of what that is, and then you are now required to obtain a seller's permit and have an account set up and then collect and remit sales tax.
So what you did there then is you started with helping the client to get on top of their books because they were keeping their books on 2 separate software applications, and you helped them to migrate and have one software application. And what was that?
That was QuickBooks Desktop.
They had QuickBooks Online and Sage. Why not use either Sage or QuickBooks Online? Why did you go to a separate system of QuickBooks Desktop?
QuickBooks Online really isn't the best software to use for somebody that does what he does as a contractor. It's not ideal. Job costing and report functionality are the 2 main things that is not great if you're a contractor and you try to use QBO.
But then you ran into that secondary issue of, well, the sales tax needs to be comprehended as well.
Right. When I found out they were using Job Nimbus and the sales team was actually the one sending out the invoices to the clients, then I look to see, well, how are you calculating sales tax? Job Nemesis isn't going to do that.
What was the nature of the work or the challenge associated with, you've got QuickBooks Desktop, you've got Avalara, press the button and it all works? Or is it not as simple as that?
No, it's not as simple as that. You have to go set up the account with Avalara, and you have to set up your tax return, tell them what type of return you need to file with California. So you have to know what tax return you need to file with California and set all of that up in Avalara, and then bring it in and install it on the server that QuickBooks Desktop is on, and then do that integration with QuickBooks and Avalara.
So give us a sense of the complexity of that, the skill level needed to be able to get all that to work. What's the skill level needed to be able to pull that off? And how much work is it, roughly?
It took about a week. You also have to work with the Avalara engineers to do that. And it does take a pretty high level of skill to be able to do that. Avalara will not set that up for you.
So in your experience, where you have talked to other bookkeepers, maybe you've interviewed them for a job or you've talked to them for other reasons, how often would you say it's likely that you're going to find a bookkeeper that is able to do that kind of work?
You're not. Most of the bookkeepers and the other accountants I've talked to doesn't even know what Avalara is.
And given that Avalara is the market leading tax application, especially associated with QuickBooks, it's surprising to me that the way you characterize it, that so few bookkeepers are aware of it or can do it.
QuickBooks will calculate sales tax. You just tell it what sales tax rate you want to use, and it'll just calculate it. I'm going to use 7.25%. That's what it is. Okay, Ohio's tax rate is 7.25%. So anything I sell in Ohio, because I have Nexus here, I'm going to make it 7.25%. And a lot of people probably just use what QuickBooks has available to them, not realizing that you're also not calculating it. If you do sales outside of Ohio, do you know what the threshold is for every state in the United States? Are you tracking that? Avalara does more than just calculate that sales tax.
If you're in QuickBooks, it's just the one flat rate. But if you go to Avalara, it knows every district, every city. What
you're saying is that in some states, you can get away with just knowing the flat tax rate for that state, and it stays the same wherever anybody is. But if somebody is in California or in a state where it's not that simple, or doing business across multiple states, then that's where Avalara really adds value.
That's correct. Some of these people just don't know what they don't know. If you're selling to other multiple states, yeah, you don't have Nexus there. You're correct about that. But at some point you could.
So that's Avalara. Was there other integration or other software that you've helped to integrate?
ADP, Payroll. When you look at a profit and loss, you want to be able to see what's the officer compensation, what is the payroll tax expenses, IRA deductions, health insurance, health and dental and medical and all that stuff that they do with their employees. And none of that was being tracked. And there was no good data for that. So ADP is a major payroll company. So they had something called a general ledger that you could go in and create a general ledger. What are the accounts that are being used in ADP, and what accounts do I want that same information to come into QuickBooks? You create that general ledger file, and then every time they run payroll, I go create a ledger file that I can bring into QuickBooks every time they run payroll. I create it, I export it, and then I go copy it onto the server and import it into QuickBooks, and it comes in and brings all of the information and puts it exactly where I need it to go. That took me a couple of days to get that all set up, and then I tested it. So again, is going to be a software setup. It did have a little bit of accounting into it because you had to go look at the accounting file and say, where do I want to see these things on a profit and loss? How would the owner want to see this on the profit and loss? And then go set up your chart of accounts in the accounting system to be able to bring that stuff in. So that's the accounting piece of it. The rest of it was all basically software driven. It's not real likely that you're going to have somebody that just does accounting that is going to have that skill set as well.
So if a typical bookkeeper was faced with that issue, what would their reaction typically be? What would they do if they, would they basically have no idea what to do, or what, how would they handle it?
I think probably with all of these things like ADP or Avalar or whatever, they would probably rely on their IT department to kind of work these things out for them, to go set these things up, these accounts up, and get them all set up. And probably most owners would too. They would just rely on their IT department.
Which is the problem he had, because there's no IT department, number one, and the bookkeeper they've got didn't know how to integrate those two programs. So the problem was they were disparate, and the information going to QuickBooks wasn't right. So that's where someone like Linda, her knowledge of being able to do integration actually helped the client a lot, because she was able to get that integration and get everything going into QuickBooks. Normal bookkeepers couldn't do it because the one they had couldn't do it.
It strikes me part of the added value as well is just knowing that there's integration to be done in the first place.
Right, and that's where I think we have an advantage with some of these clients, because a lot of clients are unaware of what business tools and applications that are out there that could really greatly enhance their accounting process and their financial reporting. And they're just limited to only what their accounting software can do for them out of lack of knowledge.
So who was doing the bookkeeping for them previously?
Internal full-time bookkeeper.
So in that particular case, they had an internal full-time bookkeeper, but even though they had a full-time bookkeeper, they weren't able to do these things. You're still working with them to get on top of the books. If they had all these problems when you started, why isn't the bookkeeper that they've got sorting these things out? If they're a bookkeeper, surely they would know how to do all this.
Right. And that's what I'm saying. It's either for just either lack of knowledge that there are other applications and tools that you can use to make your life easier. You're doing a lot of manual work that you don't need to do.
So did you take over from that bookkeeper, or are they still there? What's the setup?
I didn't take over for that bookkeeper. I work in conjunction with that bookkeeper to do the more advanced level of things. Like when they have things like that, then I set those up and get those integrated. And then I work with his team to train his team on how to log that stuff in QuickBooks. I oversee what they're doing and I do the advanced things.
Do you have another example, but with a different integration, with a different software?
Yeah, and that's with another client that used Shopify. They sell clothing. They have an online store, and they used Shopify as their merchant service provider. When I first got them, their books were just kind of a mess. They didn't have anything much in there, and what they did have in there was incorrect, and they didn't know how to log these sales that were occurring inside Shopify. How do they get those inside to QuickBooks? And they're using QuickBooks Online. So what I did with them is I went into Shopify and looked and seen how their sales were being calculated inside there, and do they have an integration with QuickBooks Online? And sure enough, they had an integration. So I worked to set that up to integrate with QuickBooks Online so that when sales occur, they automatically come across and go into QuickBooks Online and log that for him. The Shopify was a little difficult. That took me a week. I think most bookkeepers, if they didn't have those skills, they would be kind of terrified to try that. He said that now I want to sell on Amazon. We're starting that. So I need to have you look at how to set up Amazon so that we know how to log that and bring those sales into QuickBooks Online. I have another client that was using Square. He has a bookstore, a local bookstore, and he uses Square in his store. Square does not integrate. I don't even think it even integrates with QuickBooks Online. So that was very, very challenging. That one, you have to go into Square and design a report that gives you what you need. And then you download that into Excel, and then even then you have to manipulate that file in Excel to allow for when people would use a gift card or they purchase a gift card, and he offered tons of discounts. Square didn't deal with that very well. When you create a customer invoice, you have to say this sale was $500. I had $48 in discounts. They bought a gift card. And a gift card is basically now a liability for that company. You did make a sale, but it's a liability because that person hasn't used it yet. So all of that had to be set up in QuickBooks. And how do you log this properly to show it where it needs to be for the sale for that day and have it match up to what Square has, including the sales tax, because it has to go in QuickBooks. If you don't put it in QuickBooks, you don't know how much sales tax you owe. And that's where he would use QuickBooks to determine what's my sales tax liability. And then he would have to go file his sales tax return and make those payments, the sales tax payments. That probably took me about 3 weeks. That was probably one of the most difficult things I'd worked on. The reason that he asked me to set that up for him is that, you know, he had 1099 contractors that are out in the field working on these jobs, and he wasn't entirely sure that that's where they were. They were turning in time that I worked on this job for 5 hours on this day, and on Tuesday I worked 7 hours at this job. And he wasn't entirely sure that what they were turning into him, that they were working at these jobs, that they really were. So one of his main reasons for looking for a software that would track time was also a software that would track GPS and where were they. That took about 2 weeks.
So when he's reaching out more on that integration, for what exactly? What's the nature of the problem that he needs help with?
Just different problems that they have, you know, with the software. That's also where his employees would submit their expense reports. They would submit their expense reports, and then, you know, they need to be approved. And then it also pays. You can pay the employee, and it pays them from there. If you approve it and say, okay, yeah, I want to set it for payment, it also does that same thing, and it sets it for payment. There are just various problems. I've got an expense that I approved and it's not showing up in here, or just different problems that he has. I just set up Clockify. They had all of their employees will handwrite their timesheet just on paper. One of the challenges was they work on different jobs, and everything needs to be job costed for them. Part of the problem was you can't read their handwriting. They can't add. So if they work 10-hour days, that should all add up to 10 hours. You can't say that you worked 8 hours on this job and you worked 4 hours on this one and your total for the day is 10 hours. Okay, what's wrong? So I was constantly having to go back and ask these people to fix their timesheets and tell me what you really worked and what job was this really applied to. So I thought, okay, we need to come up with a better system for 2 reasons. One is I had asked them repeatedly to have somebody over there look at those timesheets before they handed them to me, so that I wasn't doing all of that and having to hand them back. And they just weren't doing that. They were still giving them to me. They still had tons of errors in almost every single one. So I thought, okay, this needs to be automated. The other thing that made it so time consuming was that, let's say in that week's time, on Monday they worked for Eaton, on Wednesday they worked for Eaton, and Friday they worked another hour for Eaton. When I'm putting that in QuickBooks and I'm logging and I'm entering their payroll, I'm just entering the total hours they had for the entire 2-week period for Eaton. From that manual timesheet, I had to manually on a calculator add up 1 hour here, 2 hours here. I'd have to look through the whole 2-week time period and look for all the Eatons.
So it's costing the client about 9 hours every 2 weeks of unnecessary cost.
Yep. So the solution is I found a software, the Clockify software, where the people go in and I enter the jobs in there. I enter all of their current jobs into that software. So when somebody wants to, say, okay, on Monday, I work this many hours, I've got it set where they have to enter a job or they can't enter their hours. So if they say they worked, pick your job and you worked how many hours and you worked on that job, that's what they're being paid for, and that's the job it's being assigned to.
Did that eliminate the whole 9 hours?
Yes, it did.